Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 10th chapter in the book of Exodus. Herein we read of the 8th and ninth plague, the plague of locust and darkness, respectively, which were indictments, respectively, of the Egyptian fertility god Osiris, because the locusts came to eat all the crops in the field, and the darkness. Now, the Egyptians were prone to sun worship, as were a lot of people in closer to equatorial proximity. A lot of them worshiped the sun, and their particular sun gods were Amun, Ra, and Horus. But the implication throughout all the 10 plagues, of which we've covered beginning in the 7th chapter, is that there is a power working on behalf of Israel, and the gods of Egypt are powerless to protect them. But the Pharaoh himself, who would have been worshipped and acknowledged as a living god, has a god complex in him. Even in this chapter, we read his officials try and advise some common sense to look at all the devastation your hard-heartedness and stubbornness is reaping on your nation, which you are supposed to protect. His god complex will not admit the power or surrender to the presence of the one and the true and the only living Elohim. And so the opening verse reads, "And Yahweh said to Moses, Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, so that I show these signs of mine before him." So he had earlier in many places alluded to the fact that he would harden his heart. There would be more than one plague unleashed because his heart is still hardened. It doesn't soften in the process of the accumulations of these plagues, which collectively devastate his land and his people. And the whole purpose was that he could show, even though he could have smitten them in a twinkle of an eye, as he makes known in an earlier chapter, he kept them alive to witness and possibly witness to the supremacy of the God of the Israelites. But this he would not do, in spite of the overwhelming evidence that there was an Elohim who was working on their behalfs. "And that you relate in the hearing of your sons and your sons' sons what I have done in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, and you shall know that I am Yahweh." So the transfer of knowledge and experience and events from one generation to the next is ingrained throughout the Bible, Old to New Testament, and we read of this as soon as the Passover ceremony. Their children are going to ask what it all means, and they are instructed to give them the correct answer. And so that is that what happened to them is intended to survive as a legacy for their progeny to benefit and learn from, to know where they came from, and hopefully not forget their origins in slavery, which Yahweh liberated them from. "And Moses and Aaron came into Pharaoh and said to him, Thus said Yahweh Elohim of the Hebrews, Till when shall you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, so that they serve me." This was not the first time that Moses had said these words or something similar to him. He wanted, his petition from the beginning was to let his people go from bondage, set them free, liberate them from their entrenched enslavement. But this the Pharaoh would not do. It would take more than 10 signs, in fact, because even though he ultimately relents at the death of his own firstborn, which we read in the next chapter, we read that he is persuaded and compelled to chase the nation which is currently escaping before they reach the promised land. And it's at the Red Sea that his chariots and horses, which Yahweh makes a passageway of land for his people to cross, then the water reverts to its natural state and swallows whole all the Pharaoh's chariots and cavalry chasing them. Or else, if you refuse to let my people go, see, tomorrow I am bringing locusts within your borders. This is also not the first time that he had said this. He often gives him a day of grace to consider what he is saying, and by this time, any objective observer would know that Yahweh was as good as his word. His promise always came to manifest, and they never took advantage of the day of grace that was allowed to them. But sure enough, the next day, this would come to pass. And the locusts were desert-dwelling insects which consumed crops wholesale in civilized lands, the agricultural abundance thereof. And they're often likened to sign and judgment, certainly here and also elsewhere throughout the entire Bible. And they shall cover the surface of the land, so that no one is able to see the land. And they shall eat the rest of what has escaped, which remains to you from the hail, which they shall eat every tree which grows up for you out of the field. So they're going to be so visibly noticeable as to be unescapable from the eyesight of anyone from the north to the south, to the east to the west, throughout the entire territorial domain of the country of Egypt. No one's going to miss them. No one's going to not notice them. And they're going to eat their whatever crops have not been destroyed by the hail, which was a previous plague, and this will be an indictment against the Egyptian deity that they called Osiris, who they worshipped as a fertility deity, and his power would not protect him. Like all the other imagined deities, and the Egyptians had some 80 of them in their polytheistic pantheon. Their metaphysical substance was nothing beyond their physical representation in the earthly items which were crafted to represent their images. They had no power. It was only imaginary. The idolatry reverses the order. If, as we read in Genesis, that man is made in the image of Elohim, then the idols are made in the image of man and animals. And they shall fill your houses, and the houses of all your servants, and the houses of all the Egyptians, which neither your fathers nor your fathers have seen, since the day that they were on the earth to this day. This is not the first allusion to some unprecedented experience we read of in hail. It rains a few days of the year in the land of Egypt, but hail was something altogether new to these people, and so too would these locusts, who would be from the desert, not to be confused with the native locust who dwelled within Egypt, but not threateningly enough to consume all their crops. And no Egyptian is going to be spared from this. There's no mention of the Israelites, so what's implied and inferred is that they will be left unscathed, even though at other locations he makes explicitly clear that he's going to mark a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And Pharaoh's servants said to him, "Till when would this one be a snare to us? Let the men go, so that they serve Yahweh their Elohim. Do you not yet know that Egypt is being destroyed?" So Pharaoh suffers from a spiritual blindness which blinds him to all of the obvious which is unfolding before his very eyes. His entire land is being devastated and ruined. The people, the animals, the crops, all the life in it is being destroyed because he won't relent. And the Pharaoh servants have come to their senses, and even though in the opening verse he mentions that his servants' hearts would be hardened, here we witness a gradual softening of their hearts in the reference to the overwhelming evidence of the obvious. Now, the reason that Pharaoh did not want to let these people go was because he thought he was protecting his nation by keeping the entrenched in slavery economy alive and embedded, but at what price was he willing to go? And ultimately, it takes more than 10 plagues. And Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, "Go serve Yahweh your Elohim. Who are the ones that are going?" So he grants them permission, but also asks a question, who among them are going? And the answer is revealed in the next verse, verse 9. And Moses said, we are going with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and our flocks and our herds. We are going, for we have a festival to Yahweh. So Moses answers his question that all of us, every man, woman, child, every son, daughter, every item of livestock that they own is going to depart in mass to worship in a festival to Yahweh. But the Pharaoh, being a realist, knows that no enslaved people whom he allows to escape to the wilderness in mass will be entrusted to come back. So he answers Moses' answer with, and he said to them, let Yahweh be with you, as I let you and your little ones go. Watch out, for evil is before your face. Not so, you men go now and serve Yahweh, for that is what you desired. And they were driven out from the presence of Pharaoh. So he only allowed and tolerated the men among them to go, because as long as he had the women in close supervision and the children, they could not escape in the wilderness where Moses was petitioning and requesting for this worship that Yahweh had called them to. But they departed from the Pharaoh's presence, and as we read at the end of the chapter, spoiler alert, they part with the words that they will never see each other's faces again. So this chapter marks the final physical confrontation, eye to eye, between Moses and Pharaoh. And Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt, for the locust to come upon the land of Egypt, and eat every plant of the land, and all that the hail has left. So we gather that Pharaoh had not utilized his day of grace in imposing a limitation on who could go to worship Yahweh in the wilderness or desert. He had exhausted his day of grace, and as he's commanding him, the physical instructions are not completely necessary, but they are commanded and instructed. So Moses obeys, and he raises his hand. Other places we read it's commonly he strikes with a staff, but this is a simple raising of hand. And just like that, what Yahweh promised yesterday becomes manifest today. And Moses stretched out his rod over the land of Egypt, and Yahweh brought an east wind on the land all that day and all that night. Morning came, and the east wind brought the locust. So we also read additional information that his rod or his staff was stretched out, not just his hand. And having done that, Yahweh releases a wind that comes from the east, which covers Egypt all the way to the west and the north and the south of the locust as promised. And the locusts are here, and they are here to stay, at least until the next plague comes to pass. And the locust went up over all the land of Egypt, and settled within all the borders of Egypt, very grievous, and there had never been locusts before them, nor would there ever be again be like them. So therein we gather that this experience and event was not only unprecedented, but unduplicated, and the whole of the borders, the whole of the country were consumed and plagued by these locusts who ate what crops remained after the hailstorm had destroyed a significant proportion of their existing crops. So they would have consumed, if not all the rest, then the majority of the rest. And the locust went up over all the land of Egypt and settled within 15th verse rather, and they covered the surface of all the land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate every plant of the land and the fruit of the trees which the hail had left, and no greenness was left on the trees or on the plants of the field in all the land of Egypt. So these locusts finished the job that the hail had started of. They had decimated their crops. They exterminate them altogether, and they were so visible and so numerous that they actually darkened the land, and the darkness becomes more intense and more extreme in the 9th plague, of which we read, the plague of darkness. And all the land of Egypt, that the 3-letter word all entails a universality. There would have been, and we read also all the fruit of the trees, so that would mean none was left by these words. Pharaoh then called Moses and Aaron in haste and said, I have sinned against Yahweh your Elohim and against you. This is not the first time that we read of Pharaoh confessing or acknowledging his sin, but confession is only foundational to the process of repentance. It begins with identifying our sin by name, judging it, forsaking it, and this Pharaoh would not do. But his act of contrition is a subtlety and manipulation. He's saying it as a ploy to lure them into his trust. And now please bear my sin only this once, and pray to Yahweh your Elohim, that he would not only turn away this death from me. So Moses is once more summoned by Pharaoh to act in an intercessory capacity, to pray on behalf of this deity of his ancestors that he knew not, but he knew that Moses knew him. And Moses willingly obliges, as we read in the next verse. And he went out to Pharaoh and prayed to Yahweh. And Yahweh turned a very strong west wind, which took the locust away and blew them into the sea of reeds. Not one locust was left within the border of Egypt. The Sea of Reeds would have been the Red Sea, so the wind from the west that would have been at the eastern extremity of Egypt, separating it from the peninsula of the Arabian Peninsula. But we read that just as there was no place, person, or livestock or crop untouched by the locust, so too we read that not one was left within all of Egypt. However, Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not let the children of Israel go. Now, what's interesting here is that it suggests or implies that Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh. He did not do it on his own initiative. Certainly, he was a creature created with agency and choice, but Yahweh could have providentially intervened to harden his heart to lead to the next plague, and this is probably not the first time we've read this throughout the chapters concerning the plagues. And Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards the heavens, and let there be darkness over the land of Egypt, even a darkness which is felt. So the same Elohim who declared, let there be light in Genesis 1:3 now declares, let there be darkness. The darkness is going to be an indictment and an establishment of the superiority of Yahweh over the Egyptian sun deities, Amun-Ra and Horus, and even if they were real, the sun, who is greater than the sun would have been elevated to artificial significance because that was recognized as the life source of what grew around the Nile. But who is greater than the sun but the one who made the sun? And that's just a common theme. He keeps establishing his dominance over these imagined impotent Egyptian deities, and the Pharaoh refused to relent, largely because he has his own God complex, which will not admit the presence or even the obvious evidence of a superior being. And Moses stretched out his hand towards the heavens, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. So 3 days is the duration. Now, as the ancient Jews counted time, a part of a day was considered or taken into the whole. So for not exactly 72 hours, but for at least 124-hour period and however much time before and after the darkness was there. And they did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, while all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. So once more, there's a clear distinction between the plague which is visited on the Egyptian and that from which the Israelites, who would have been located in the land of Goshen, there was light there, but there was darkness, so much so that no Egyptian could move or see anyone or anything. So this was a total darkness. It was blacker than any abyss. And Pharaoh called to Moses and said, "Go serve Yahweh. Only leave your flocks and your herds behind. Let your little ones go with you too." So he's incrementally relenting on his resolve. He's permitting all the human Israelites to go and worship and celebrate the festival that Yahweh calls them to in the wilderness or desert, but just to keep make them not have the possibility to escape. They would have been dependent on their animals. So he's telling them to leave them behind. He's going to let the people go, but leave the animals behind, because the people will not go permanently as long as their animals are left behind. But Moses said, "You yourself are to provide us with the sacrifices and burnt offerings to prepare Yahweh our Elohim." So the nature of this worship celebration would have been a sacrifice, and Moses is saying, all right, if you won't let us use our animals, you have to provide the ones, you have to give us the ones that we are going to sacrifice to Yahweh. And our livestock are to go with us too. Not a hoof is to be let behind, for we have to take some of them to serve Yahweh our Elohim, and we ourselves do not know with what we are to serve Yahweh until we come there. So Moses is equally as uncompromising as Pharaoh. This is a case of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. And he says that it's cloaked in mystery. All he knows is the command thus far, but Yahweh will reveal the purpose for which their animals are summoned. So Moses had the courage to stand before Pharaoh and say, no deals with you. This is what it's going to be. This is what we are commanded. This is what you're going to let us do. But as we read, Pharaoh struggles to do that. However, Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not let them go. This is a repeated theme by now. Additional commentary we feel is redundant at this point. And Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me, watch yourself, and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you die." So he's issuing an ultimatum in the form of a death threat that if he shows his presence to his face once more in his palace, that will be his last day. He's going to kill him. He's had enough of these plagues that this man is unleashing through the power of Yahweh on his land. So he's going to terminate all future relations or interchanges with this pesky former half-brother of his who was adopted and raised in Egyptian royalty under the same father, and perhaps, but now, and Moses said, "You have spoken rightly. Never again do I see your face." So Moses expresses an essential agreement. He tells him, what you said is good enough for me. You don't have to worry about me showing our face anymore, because this is all in the hands of Yahweh, and I trust him completely. And the 10th and final plague is going to be the most devastating one. This is the death of the firstborn, which touches Pharaoh himself and finally softens his heart, but not permanently enough, but just long enough to finally let his people go, let the Egyptians go. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.